The story establishes the cold, perfectionist environment of the Vaughn mansion. It introduces Alexander's mandate. We do not cry in this house. It shows Isabella's struggle, eyes red and swollen, hiding her face to avoid her father's disapproval. It sets up the irony of a man in a sharp blue suit who closes billion-dollar mergers, but is defeated by the sight of a child's sniffle. In a house made of gold and glass, the loudest sound was the silence of a child forbidden to grieve. The billionaire's mansion had everything, but peace had quietly packed its bags the night Alexander Vaughn's wife passed away. On the afternoon of the funeral, Alexander stood in the center of the grand foyer, his sharp blue suit fitting like armor against the world. He looked down at his daughter, Isabella, whose small face was already beginning to crumple, her eyes red and swollen from a loss she couldn't yet name. To Alexander, those tears were not a release. They were a terrifying reminder of a vulnerability he could no longer afford. He knelt until he was eye level with her, his posture rigid and his voice as cold as the marble floors. "We do not cry in this house, Isabella," he commanded, his words acting as a mandate for the Vaughn legacy. He told her that tears were a weakness, a storm that only served to drown those who stayed in them. He believed that by banning the sound of sorrow, he could protect them both from the jagged edges of their own heartbreak. From that moment on, the no-crying rule became the invisible foundation of the mansion. Alexander buried himself in his work, closing billion-dollar deals with ease while using his wealth to build a wall between his heart and his grief. He convinced himself that success was the only cure for pain, and that emotional stoicism was the greatest gift he could provide for his daughter. Every time Isabella's breath hitched or her lip trembled, Alexander would look away, his eyes hardening with a silent shame that made her pull back into herself. He was a man who ruled a boardroom but was terrified of a single sniffle, fearing that if even one tear fell, the entire empire he had built would shatter under the weight of his own repressed agony. He had chased success to give comfort, yet he had established a world where the only thing missing was the warmth of a heartbeat. Isabella learned to hide in the shadows of the vast rooms, a hollow shell of a child who understood that her father's love was conditional on her silence. The rule was meant to save them, but as the weeks passed, it only ensured that they were drowning in a silence no money could replace. Isabella grew up as a tear-streaked shadow within the cold, echoing expanse of the Vaughn mansion. Though she was an heiress to a vast fortune, she lived as a hollow shell, drifting through rooms that felt more like a marble tomb than a home. Alexander provided her with every luxury imaginable: expensive toys that blinked and whirred, designer clothes, and a nursery filled with gadgets. But they were merely distractions for a child who was starving for affection. Isabella would sit for hours surrounded by these treasures, her small hands resting still, refusing to touch the playthings that felt as empty as the air around her. Her life became a performance of the silence her father demanded. In the presence of Alexander, she learned to pull her grief deep inside, holding her breath until her chest ached, desperate to ensure no sound of sorrow escaped her lips. Her eyes were often red and swollen, the physical evidence of the storm she was forced to weather alone in the dark, away from the judgmental gaze of a father who viewed her pain as a liability. She moved with a quiet, fragile grace, careful not to break the heavy stillness that had settled over the house since her mother passed away. The staff watched her from the corners of the hallways, whispering about the hollow heiress, who never smiled and never cried. They saw a child who had everything but possessed nothing that truly mattered. Isabella would often stand by the tall windows, watching the world outside with a longing that no money could satisfy, trapped in a golden cage where the price of her father's approval was her own spirit. She was a child who had forgotten how to play, her identity consumed by the silent shame of her father's inability to face his own broken heart. In this environment of unlimited abundance, she remained a prisoner of a no-crying rule that had turned her childhood into a long, quiet nightmare. One evening, exhaustion and a growing, heavy shadow of guilt forced Alexander to seek new help, leading to the arrival of Margaret Maggie Whitmore. While the rest of the staff moved through the mansion like polished clockwork, Maggie arrived with a simple, quiet demeanor and eyes that looked tired but held a deep, kind wisdom. The other servants whispered in the corridors, doubting her worth. To them, she appeared far too young and ordinary for a task that had already defeated world-class experts. They saw only an elderly woman in a beige top and a clean white apron, someone who lacked the prestige usually required to enter the Vaughn legacy. Yet, where the others saw a sensitive professional failure, Maggie saw a child drowning in a silence no money could replace. She did not rush into the nursery with the frantic pressure or panic that the previous nurses had shown. Instead, Maggie stood still at the door, watching Isabella with patient, gentle eyes that held a depth of concern mixed with lived experience. From the hallway camera, Alexander watched closely with his arms folded tight, his rigid posture a sharp contrast to the soft, protective aura Maggie radiated. He expected another failure to break him, but Maggie moved with a calm touch that felt warm and safe. She didn't reach for the costly toys or the blinking machines that filled the room. Instead, she sat on the neatly made bed, her face lined with a quiet strength that seemed to acknowledge the grief the mansion tried so hard to bury. While the rest of the house lived in fear of a single sob, Maggie's faint, reassuring smile suggested she knew a truth Alexander had long forgotten. That children do not need luxury, they only need warmth that feels real. She began a low, soft humming, a tune that sounded like an old lullaby, not to silence the pain, but to offer it a place to finally rest. The staff continued to doubt her, but for the first time in many painful nights, a fragile peace began to settle over the marble halls, as if an angel had finally entered the kitchen and found the recipe for a broken heart. The following afternoon, Maggie did not attempt to coax Isabella out of her room with words or toys. Instead, she went to the kitchen and began to work with a quiet, deliberate grace. While the other chefs prepared intricate, cold hors d'oeuvres for Alexander's evening meetings, Maggie reached for simple, earthy ingredients, onions, herbs, and a specific blend of spices she had found tucked away in the back of the pantry. As the stove flickered to life, a scent began to drift through the vents of the mansion, rising like a ghost through the marble halls. It wasn't the smell of a five-star restaurant, but something humbler. The rich, savory aroma of a mother's secret recipe, a meal that had not been cooked in the Vaughn house since the night the light went out. Isabella, sitting motionless in the middle of her vast bedroom, suddenly lifted her head. Her nose twitched, and for the first time in weeks, her eyes lost their vacant stare. The scent hit her deeper than any business loss or luxury gadget ever could, because it carried the weight of a memory she had been too afraid to touch. Slowly, as if pulled by an invisible thread, the girl who had become a tear-streaked shadow stood up and followed the aroma down the grand staircase. She found Maggie in the kitchen, her flour-dusted apron a stark contrast to the stainless steel perfection of the room. Maggie didn't turn around immediately. She simply hummed that low, old lullaby as she stirred the pot, letting the steam carry the warmth of the past toward the child. When Isabella finally reached the counter, her voice, unused for so long, came out as a fragile whisper. "Mama's soup," she breathed, the words breaking the silence she had been forbidden to disturb. Maggie turned then, her eyes filled with that depth of wisdom and concern, and offered a small spoonful to the girl. As the taste of the broth touched Isabella's tongue, the no-crying rule finally began to fracture. The sensory power of the meal acted as a key to a locked place, and as the girl swallowed, a single, hot tear escaped her red and swollen eyes. Maggie didn't shush her or look away in shame. She simply stepped forward and wrapped a maternal arm around the girl's shaking shoulders, allowing the smell of memory to provide the comfort that money never could. Alexander Vaughn strode toward the kitchen, his mind still racing with the logistics of a billion-dollar merger. He was looking for a glass of water to wash away the bitter taste of a long day, but he stopped dead in the doorway, his leather shoes silent on the cold tiles. His rigid posture, usually an emblem of his power, suddenly felt like a cage as he witnessed a scene that defied every rule he had established for his legacy. There, in the center of the room, was the old cook, Maggie Whitmore, sitting on a wooden chair with Isabella clinging to her chest as if her life depended on it. Alexander's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He was stunned, gripped by a shocked realization that left him unable to move. He had spent a fortune on therapists and expensive distractions to keep his daughter's grief at bay. Yet a stranger in a flower-dusted apron had achieved the impossible. Isabella was not just whimpering. She was letting out the storms of sorrow he had spent weeks trying to suppress. Her face was red and swollen, and her small hands were gripped tightly into Maggie's beige sweater, seeking the security of a heartbeat that Alexander had been too broken to offer himself. The cook didn't look up with fear or seek his praise. She simply held the child with a gentle and protective strength, her hand resting over Isabella's arm in a maternal gesture that radiated unconditional love. Alexander watched from the shadows of the door, his sharp blue suit feeling increasingly heavy. He had tried to provide peace through gold and glass, but in the soft, rhythmic swaying of the old woman, he saw the miracle he had witnessed overnight in the nursery, a warmth that felt real. A wave of fear hit him, as he realized a stranger understood his daughter's heart better than he did. For the first time, his pride felt like a business loss he couldn't afford. And as he watched the fragile silence of the room fill with his daughter's healing tears, the weight of his own regret became something he could no longer ignore. Alexander took a slow step into the kitchen, his voice tight with the authority he used to command boardrooms. He demanded to know why the rules had been ignored, his eyes darting from Isabella's shaking shoulders to the calm, steady gaze of the woman holding her. Maggie did not flinch or rise in a panic. She simply adjusted her hold on the girl, ensuring the child felt safe even as the atmosphere grew heavy with Alexander's disapproval. Her expression remained gentle, but held a depth of wisdom that made his rigid posture feel suddenly brittle. She looked at the man in the sharp blue suit and spoke softly, her words carrying more weight than any business loss he had ever suffered. She told him that while he had built an empire of gold and glass to hide from the pain, his daughter was starving for the one thing money could never buy. Maggie's voice was a low, steady hum as she told him the truth that cut through his pride. A child's tears aren't a sign of weakness, Alexander. They are a plea for a father who stays. She explained that by banning her grief, he wasn't making her strong. He was making her a stranger in her own home. The silence that followed was not the hollow, forced quiet Alexander was used to, but a fragile space where the truth began to sink in. Maggie looked at his stunned expression, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide as if seeing the world for the first time. She reminded him that babies and children do not need the luxury of marble halls. They only need the warmth of a heartbeat that feels real. Alexander stood there, paralyzed by a wave of fear and silent shame, realizing that the no-crying rule had been a wall he built to protect himself, not her. For weeks, he had chosen work calls and meetings over the midnight comfort his daughter required. And now, hearing the steady breathing of the girl against Maggie's chest, he felt the weight of his regret become an unbearable burden. He looked at the old cook, her face lined with age and quiet strength, and realized that she understood the heartbeat of his family better than he did. That evening, the mansion was braced for the usual storm of activity that accompanied Alexander Vaughn's global mergers. His phone hummed incessantly in his pocket, a frantic digital pulse signaling that a billion-dollar deal was teetering on the edge of completion. In the past, this was the sound that would have pulled him away, a convenient excuse to escape the heavy silence of the nursery and the tear-streaked shadow of his daughter. But as he stood in the grand hallway, the cook's words echoed louder than the ringing, reminding him that real success meant nothing if his daughter grew up without the memory of his arms around her. With a hand that trembled slightly, Alexander reached into his pocket and, for the first time in his career, silenced the device, letting the screen go dark. He walked toward Isabella's door with slow, nervous steps, his sharp blue suit feeling like a discarded skin. Instead of rushing in with the stiff fear of a man who didn't know his own child's heart, he simply sat on the cold floor outside her room, his back against the wood. For an hour, he didn't check the time or prepare a pitch. He just listened. He heard the small, fragile sounds of Isabella moving inside, the soft breaths and occasional whimpers that he had once branded as weakness. The silence he had once enforced now felt like a sacred space he was finally invited to enter. Sitting there in the dim light of the hallway, the silent shame, that had followed him into every room began to shift into a quiet, focused presence. He realized that for weeks he had been running toward success to avoid the empty side of the bed, and the children who cried for a comfort he never learned to give. Now he chose the floor over the boardroom, letting his heartbeat speak where words would fail. He stayed there long after the calls stopped coming, guarding her rest like something sacred, realizing that this moment of standing still carried more value than any fortune he had ever chased. Inside his heart, a locked place opened quietly, and for the first time since the loss shattered his home, hope began to live there again, small and fragile, but growing strong. The following night, the mansion was plunged into an unexpected darkness as a sudden storm knocked out the power, silencing the expensive gadgets and blinking security lights. In the sudden heavy gloom, the no-crying rule finally shattered under the weight of raw, human fear. From the nursery, a sound erupted that Alexander could no longer ignore. Not a soft whimper, but a storm of tears as Isabella's suppressed grief finally boiled over in the dark. Alexander's heart raced, the old panic rising fast, but this time he did not call for help or step away in fear. He rushed into the room, guided only by the sound of her heartbreak, and found her huddled on the bed, her face red and swollen from the tears she had held back for so long. Maggie stood nearby, having lit a small candle that cast long, dancing shadows against the marble walls. She did not take over. She simply watched as the billionaire, still in his sharp blue suit, reached out with shaking hands. For the first time, Alexander did not offer a briefcase or a command. He offered his chest. As Isabella clung to his shirt, her tiny hands tight with a trust she had almost forgotten, the locked place in Alexander's heart opened with a physical ache. He pulled her close, letting her head rest near his heartbeat, and as the heat of her tears soaked through his suit, his own rigid posture finally broke. The man who had closed billion-dollar deals with ease began to weep, his voice breaking as he whispered apologies for the nights he chose work over love. It was a final moment of tension where the silent shame of his pride was washed away by a shared sorrow. He sat on the floor, cradling his daughter in the candlelight, realizing that the strength he had spent a lifetime building was nothing compared to the courage it took to stay in this moment of pain. As they cried together, the room filled not with the cold echo of a mansion, but with a warmth that felt real for the first time since his wife had passed away. In that darkness, Alexander understood that fear leaves when love stays present and does not run. He had finally found his way back to being a father. Years passed, and the mansion once defined by the cold silence of gold and glass began to breathe with a new, vibrant life. The marble halls no longer echoed with the storms of suppressed grief, but with the small laughs, soft cries, and the unfiltered sounds of a family finally healing. Alexander Vaughn had undergone a profound transformation, leaving behind the man who once hid behind billion-dollar deals and rigid suits. He had adjusted his world, leaving the office early and choosing bedtime stories over meetings that once felt urgent. He learned that real success carried no value if his children grew up without the memory of his arms around them, realizing that real comfort begins with presence, not money or pride. Isabella was no longer a tear-streaked shadow drifting through a golden cage. She had grown into a girl who knew that her father's love was a sanctuary, not a conditional reward for her silence. The no-crying rule had been replaced by a sacred bond where honesty was welcomed and second chances were earned slowly. Alexander kept a photo of his late wife in the nursery, no longer as a painful reminder to be avoided, but as a guiding light, telling Isabella daily how deeply her mother had loved her first. He had even created a foundation in his wife's name, helping other parents who struggled through the long, lonely nights of grief. Maggie Whitmore eventually left the mansion, her job done, leaving behind a home rebuilt not by wealth but by the warmth that feels real. Alexander often thought of the quiet angel with gratitude, knowing her kindness had helped a broken father wake up before his regret became permanent. He understood now that redemption begins the moment love is chosen over everything else, and that strength is found in staying when moments are hard and uncertain. The mansion was no longer an empty palace. It was a home where hope lived, fragile but growing strong, because a father had finally learned that his presence was the only thing his daughter truly needed.